All right, good afternoon, friends. We are here to pick up a conversation, and I don't mind if you need to take care of yourselves. I've often, as I've worked with groups, have said that, while we're working here, if you need to care for the restroom, or if you hear a cup of coffee calling, or do whatever I happen to be working on, please pay attention to whatever you're feeling. I've often said that my wife and I have raised two boys through their adolescent years, and I am very comfortable talking to people who are walking away from me. So we're okay. I do know that when Methodists gather in the settings that you're in, that it feels compressed, it feels tight. And so it's hard to turn your attention from one thing to another all the time. And there is a point at which we simply need to take a deep breath. Because what we're doing is we're trying to pick up a conversation, and a conversation is something that has its natural rhythm. And it also has the need for time and space. Conversations don't happen quickly. They generate over time. I was going to go into this a little bit later, but let me start here, because I do want us to sit back a little bit into a more reflective, thoughtful mode. I am trying to pick up a conversation from last night. I am trying to get you ready to pick up a conversation that you will take back home to your local churches. And conversation is the way that we teach each other what no one else can teach us. They are the ways in which we learn. The way that David Bohm and William Isaacs would lay it out is that in conversation, I say something, and then you respond. And in your response, I now know that you didn't understand what I was trying to say, and so what I do, I clarify. And when I clarify, you now know that I didn't understand what you were trying to say. And what they pointed out is that in those kinds of conversations, if we stay in them long enough, we will teach each other what neither one of us was able to see. Move about, do what you need. Because the conversation that we are picking up and that we are moving ahead is one that has to mature anyhow. It isn't simply the passing on of information. It is finding the right question that can open the door for the movement of the Spirit yet again. And it takes time. How are we doing? We okay? Don't forget, this is where you say yes. All right. Because I want to pick up the conversation from last night about the surprisingly changed mission field. Well, let's see where our points are here. I said last night to both of the groups, both the clergy and the lay people, that the established institutional church cannot now thrive on the good leadership it currently has. And we spent time on that. And that it was good work that you and I have been about over these past decades. This has not been us running into problems. It is not a product of things gone wrong. It is the product of a world that has changed. And so that's the part I want to get us into now, the shift in the culture. I mentioned this last night to both groups, that we have shifted from a culture that has centered around communal values and are now living in a culture that is surrounded by individual values. And it is that fundamental shift that we need to understand as deeply as possible if we are going to be able to take steps ahead. To not understand this will, I hate to use the word condemn, but because it is a constriction, but to not understand the shift in the mission field that has come to surround us will obligate us to continue to do what we already know how to do, and we will do it faster and faster, harder and harder, until we exhaust ourselves for no further movement of the Spirit. If in my work there is a fundamental piece that has to be engaged, it is this. And so we're going to talk about this fundamental shift from the mid-20th century when we were a communal people to the end of the 20th and our 21st century where we are now an individual people. And to understand this, let me suggest that we first step back a little bit, because what we're going to do is we're going to walk into generational cohort theory. A generational cohort is that group of people who were all born around the same time. A generational cohort usually spans somewhere between 17 and 19 years. People who were born in a similar segment of time have experienced life and the world in a similar way, and it makes those people in that birth cohort even more like each other in their assumptions about the world than they are even like others in their family born at a different time. We experience life in the same way, and we live with the assumptions of that experience in the same way. What William Strauss and Neil Howe have pointed out in their work in generational history is that every single generational cohort corrects the excesses that they see in the generation that went before. Now, what they're talking about here is that every single generation, we talk about them as the silents, the baby boomers, the Gen Xers, the millennials. Every one of those groups looks at the people who went right before them and makes their judgment about what has to be corrected. For instance, we see this easily in childbirth and in child raising, where one generation wants to be very, very structured and careful about how they raise their children. I was raised by a generation of people who believed that children should be seen but not heard, only to be followed by the next generation that said, no, that wasn't right, that was too restrictive. What we need to do is we need to help our children find their space and their place. We need to hear their voices. And that's the generation that they want to go out to eat. They say to the kids, where do you want to go? Because they have corrected an excess, which will only come back in other generations. How we know? Does this make sense? Have you seen this? And so this is ongoing. As a matter of fact, one of the little attributes that they will talk about is that is the reason why every single generational cohort speaks badly of the one that went before and the one that comes after. Now you think about that, friends. You who are people of congregations, and you may have anywhere from 3 to 5 generations that come and sit with you on a Sunday morning, each one critical of the other, and you propose something that you want full agreement that will make everybody happy. Friends, that is not in the cards. One of the things we have to get to as quickly as possible is that ministry, Christian ministry, congregational life is not about happiness and satisfaction. There is something richer and deeper going on here, because this is the fabric of people's lives, of how we live together. And so we go, finding our way as a people. Well, what Strauss and Howe point out is that every once in a while, not often, but every once in a while, these self-corrections that we go through a period which is not really a correction, it's a reversal. It's a 180-degree turn. And friends, in my lifetime, we have been through one. It doesn't happen often, but we have been through one. It began in the 1960s, well into the 1970s. It was, if you will, this shift from a culture that centered around the values of community and reversed itself to become a culture that's centered around the values of the individual. And so what we're going to do is we're going to walk through a couple of markers here. And as we do that, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to think about where have you experienced this? And I'd like you to think about where have you seen this in your family? And I'd like you to think about how has this found its way into your congregation or into your business or into your profession or into your volunteer work. In other words, what we're describing is not an issue that belongs just to the church. The church is living in this mission field that has been going through this all along. So, let's get started. Charles Handy, who was an organizational consultant and a professor of business in Britain, talks about the fact that we have shifted from a convergent time to a divergent time. And I think that this is an easy way for us to talk about this kind of a shift. In a convergent time, which is this communal value that I've been talking about, in a convergent time, people have the same question and they also have the same answer. There is a lot of agreement on the way people think about things. For instance, a convergent question for us who are in this hall together would be, how far is it to the conference center? Because we're all sitting in the same place, the question is the same and the answer is the same. How are we doing? We okay? All right, easy enough. But you see, in a convergent time, because there's an expectation that the question and answer will be the same for everybody, anybody who has a different answer hides their different answer and blends together with the group. This is one of the reasons Robert's Rules of Order worked so well at that time. Robert's Rules of Order measured what the center was and everybody quickly moved to it. Does that make sense? Tremendous amount of agreement. People tried to look like each other. One of the things that I often say is that my wife and I, who went to high school together, don't forget that was 1965, there were no gay students in my high school. Because if there were, in a convergent culture, they had to work very hard to make themselves look like everybody else and appear like everybody else and behave like everybody else. It was a convergent time. But during this shift, we have moved away from a convergent time to a divergent time. And a divergent time is one in which Charles Handy would say, the question is the same for everybody, but the answers are different. A divergent question for us all sitting here in the room today would be not how far is it to the conference center, but rather, why do you want to go to the conference center? And there would be multiple reasons, including that large group of you who never want to go there. A divergent question brings out the differences among us. Back in a convergent time, the question, what does vital worship look like, was a very convergent question, because vital worship looked very much like that first page of the hymnal where they had the order of worship, and on Sunday morning you could tell what time it was without looking at your watch by where you were in the order of worship. It was a convergent time. One of the most divergent questions that churches face into today is, what does vital worship look like? Because the answers are all over the place. Do you feel the difference? Do you feel the difference? And so, if you will, we came from a time in which we lived in cultural consensus. And we have now moved to a time in which there is individual preference. When my wife and I went back to our 50th high school class reunion, guess who was there? Our gay friends. Because now, in a culture that highlights the individual preference, they are, if you will, even under obligation to present themselves as gay before they blend back in with their classmates. This is a huge shift and do not miss the fact that the United Methodist Church, back a little bit further than that, it was only the Methodist Church, had its greatest strength and felt its grandest vitality supported by a time of consensus. It was very convergent. All right, let's push a little bit further into this. I really want you to get your fingers into it a little bit. I'd like to talk about a social contract. A social contract, oh, thank you. Oh, it was only water.
Sorry.
A social contract is how you and I agree to be with one another. On what basis will we form community? What's expected of us in treating one another? How should we behave? And if we have gone through this value shift, what has changed as well is our social contract. Daniel Yankovic, who did most of the research around marketing back in the 1960s, 70s through the 80s and was a master, would talk about the fact that the social contract in that time of convergence was one that was a giving, getting compact. Now I want you to listen to this closely, because in order for me to get something, I have to give something. Under those rules in our culture, if I wanted to have a happy life, I had to be a good employee. I had to faithfully go to work every day. I had to treat my wife well. I had to be good to my kids. I had to take care of my property and wash my car. And if I did all those things, in return, I would get a good living lifestyle. I would get a happy family. When I was old, I would get kids who would take care of me, and I would have a pension. Do you hear it? If I give, I will get. Friends, do you know how easy it was in the time of this social contract to preach a stewardship sermon? What you did is you held up the budget and said, here's what we need for next year. Here's how many people are. Here's your fair share. Now that we've settled that, let's sing the next hymn. Because it was a convergent time where everybody came together for those kinds of things. If we had a giving-getting compact as a social contract, when our value system shifted, it shifted to what Hugh Heckler calls the moral pole star. And now our social contract is one in which each of us is responsible for their own happiness and finding everything that they want in life, and are able to do that up to the extent where they intrude on anybody else's right to do exactly the same thing. In other words, I seek and I search out whatever I want and whatever satisfies and rewards my needs, as long as I don't interfere with you doing the same thing. Do you hear the difference? One is a social contract based on relationships with one another. The other is a social contract based only on the individual and how far they're able to extend themselves. We have come a very long way. I thought the bishop's address this morning was very, very helpful and centered and balanced, and an example of courageous leadership. Friends, it begs the question, why do we as a people, now, I know I'm saying this to a whole bunch of Methodists, but you got to understand, I could be saying this to Episcopalians or Presbyterians or Reformed Jews or any of the other groups that I work with. Why is it that when we reach these moments, somehow we are so intent on wanting only our own scripture interpretation to be regarded and none others? Why is it that our answer has to be the answer for all? Certainly this is complex, but friends, do you not see that even within us, this is the moral pole star at work? This is our culture telling us that we should be seeking out the answer that we have and to find the other people that agree to us. As much as we would hope and pray that the Christian church and the Christian message could change the culture, it has always been the fact that it has been the culture that has influenced the Christian community. We are very much a part of this landscape that we are describing as the mission field. Back when there was a communal time, there was a very large middle class. This is what you all know about the product of the Second World War coming back. And we brought all of these people in the middle class together. As a matter of fact, the United Methodist Church has been birthed out of the middle class in this latest revision of ours. And in the middle class, people negotiated their differences. When you moved out to the suburbs, you moved into people who were like you in many ways and different from you in many other ways, and you learned how to negotiate it. I love Tom Long's notion of a congregation. He says a congregation is the place that you and I go to be with people that we would not choose to be with under any other circumstance. Because when you go in, there's all these people with different ideas and different wishes, who like different hymns and want to see the preacher do different things. And that's because all the differences are welcome, because we're all there because of a shared faith. But in those differences in the congregation, you have to negotiate. You have to kind of work with people to figure out what's important and negotiate. When we have moved over to the individual culture, we no longer negotiate. The Gilded Age, which is now what it's called, in the Gilded Age, instead of having kind of a frequency distribution, which is a bell-shaped curve with the middle class in the middle, the Gilded Age is an inverted bell-shaped curve in which you've got a tremendous amount of wealth on one side and a tremendous amount of poverty on the other side, and no conversation between the two. Do you not know that the smallest portion of our American body that is making most of the decisions is making decisions on behalf of all of the rest of the people whom they deeply do not understand? This is the non-negotiating culture of a Gilded Age that is locked into individual values. How are we doing? Is this making sense? Nod yes, and I keep going. What can I say? And so isn't it natural that we would see that the communal time was a time of civility, that the individual time was a time of incivility, and that in the communal time, now don't forget, the United Methodist Church and the Methodist Church before it was birthed out of the middle class, and it was birthed out of this communal culture, that the mainline church was preference. That doesn't mean that, that in comparison to the evangelical church or any other modification that you want to talk about, it isn't a conversation about who is right and who is wrong. It's just that the culture preferenced it. Because the mainline church always talked about being in ministry together. The music of the mainline church was sung from a hymnal. Do y'all remember hymnals? A hymnal is when you stand up next to each other and there are 4 parts and you sing your part in order to join in with other people, and you all face the front because you are all engaged in a common activity to remind the group who it is. Most of the hymns of the hymnal are not really hymns to God. They are hymns sung by a group to remind the group who they are and what they believe. In Christ there is no east or west. God knows that. That's us standing up to remind ourselves. A mighty fortress is our God. That's us reminding ourselves in 4 parts where everybody gets to play their own part. Do you hear how communal this experience is? We did everything by committee. How communal can you get? We were preferenced. The culture pushed people toward us. And we essentially, if you will, friends, please hear this is descriptive, not evaluative. We ended up with people who were more religious and didn't give as much thought to being spiritual. Membership was what it was about. We're now in a time in which the evangelical and the independent church are much more preference because by their nature, they focus more on individuals and the faith of the individual, even their music, praise music with raised hands. This isn't music that's sung with one another or to one another. This is music that connects the person with God. Now, I hope you're hearing this. Not one is good and one is bad. They are very different. And the dual commandment of loving God and loving the neighbor means that we should be very comfortable in both. But over time, the culture preferences one more than the other. So, if we move on, if you can kind of capture that kind of a question, that's why I started yesterday talking about the culture pushing people away from congregations. We're no longer in that communal time. We're no longer walking with the culture. We are a countercultural group, and that's not really a problem. That's a condition. That's the new thing that we have to learn with. And the good news is that's the position that the Christian church thrives in, because it has always been the position of the biblical text. One of the things that Walter Brueggemann has said is that the biblical text functions as a second thought coming after the initial description of our life in the world according to the dominant narrative of our society, which I love that sentence, but it was written by an academic, so let's look at it a different way. There is a dominant story that the culture tells, and then there is the story of Jesus Christ. And Walter Brueggemann, going back into the Old Testament, would say that the dominant story back in the Exodus was Pharaoh. Pharaoh had all the strength, he had all the power, he had all the land, he had the armies. It was all his game to play. Therefore, God called Moses, a slave who had trouble speaking. Because the dominant story is that wealth and power rises with those who hold it, and the alternative story is that the power of God rests with the weak and with the pure of heart. There is this other story that we need to be able to walk into. When the world is polarized as the dominant narrative, it is the church's role to be interconnected. When the culture is telling us that it's okay to be in it for anything and everything that you can get, it is the church's role to come back as the alternative narrative to say that life is really lived when we live it for others. We are in the alternative position, which gives us more strength than we have had in the last 50 years. If we would stop our anxiety about growth and money. So it requires great things of us. One of the things that I've said is we have to get back to purpose. We can move ahead there. I tried to make a point of it last night that getting back to purpose is all about that, making disciples and changing communities. But even here, let's walk into it a little bit further. One of the things that is now in front of us as an established institution is in this new mission field, in this cultural shift when everything is new and we have to learn new things and we have to change ourselves, one of the decisions has to be, what mission are we going to pursue? Because one of the things that has been pointed out by Robert Quinn in his work on deep change is that over time, every single institution and organization develops both a public mission and a private mission. A public mission is what it tells the world what it does. We make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. That is our public mission. But over time, Quinn says, an organization, an institution also develops a private mission, which is the satisfaction of the strongest of the constituent voices within the organization. Now hear this. One of the examples that he uses is public education. It's easy to see there. The public mission of a school system is to educate children. Simple enough, okay? But the private mission of a school system is to satisfy the strongest of the constituent voices that make up that system, and those strong constituent voices are whom? Teachers, board members, parents, community organizations, government regulations. Guess who did not make the list? Do you see it? Unless an organization is careful, over time it drifts away from its public mission and picks up its private mission. Our public mission is making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. Our private mission is the satisfaction of the strongest constituent voices within our system, which are the clergy, the congregations, the caucus groups, the general agencies, the book of discipline. Who did not make the list? Disciples didn't, and communities didn't. Friends, many of our congregations are set up to satisfy the constituent people who are already there. And I suspect if I ask you to write it down, you could put on paper right now the names of the strongest constituent voices that you do not want to upset when you go home. That's why we're pushing at this, friends, because if we are going to be in ministry together, in this changed mission field, we are going to have to go back to the public mission and sacrifice the private mission, which means you and I are going to need to make ourselves and others uncomfortable in a very deep way. It was no accident that I was talking about being quietly courageous, not boldly saying, I've got the answer, come follow me, but quietly saying, we have some things to talk about, some difficult conversations. And as a part of this, we have to become very intentional. Let me introduce an idea that many of you who have worked with me before and been with me before are already tired of. And so as you see this come by, just nod your head and we'll just keep going. But for others, I'd like this to be part of a kind of an idea that we'll be able to build on, particularly in our next conversation tomorrow. So I want to talk about becoming intentional. And we're going to talk about Edwards Deming and his simple model of systems. Now, Edwards Deming was he called himself a statistical consultant, but he was the person who was invited in by the Japanese after the Second World War to help them to build their manufacturing industry. During that Second World War, manufacturing was pretty much totally destroyed in Japan, and they needed to rebuild. And as they were rebuilding, they called on Edwards Deming because of what they had heard about him, and he helped them to rebuild, but not rebuild just to replace what was, to rebuild it with renewed and different purpose. Do you realize that before the Second World War, the thing that Japan was most notably thought of in terms of manufacturing was junk? Plastic junk, stuff that you and I didn't need, but somehow we kept buying. After they reinvented their manufacturing, they became the global leader in high technology, and they have remained in that ever since because they rethought what they were doing. And the very simple idea that was behind it from Edwards Deming was a model of a system that says that every system that you can think of, including a congregation, is made up of three component parts: the input, the throughput, and the output. The input is that which goes into it. They are the resources and the nouns. The throughput are the activities. They are the verbs, all trying to come to some outcome, which is the intentional difference that we're called to make. How are we doing? Simple enough idea, fair? Friends, most nonprofit organizations, and overwhelmingly most congregations, do not know what their output is. They do not know what they're trying to make different. If I were to ask you this year, what is the priority that your church has to make something different in the lives of the people in your church or the community in which you live? What is the one thing you have already agreed by consensus and by call that you will work diligently and intentionally to make different because it's important? There would not be many clear answers in the room. Fair? And so what happens to us is that whenever an organization can't name its output, it begins to worry about and to measure its inputs and its throughputs. We start worrying about our resources and activities. Can we make this year's budget? And how many kids are in the youth group for all that money we're trying to pay? Do you hear us? Reggie McNeil has said that the default benchmark for the Christian church right now is simply the measure of how many, how often, and how much. That's all we want to know. How many people are coming to work? Coming to work. How many people are coming to worship? How much money are they given? And how many Bible studies do we have? And how many people are in it? And our anxiety drives us to no end. We now have boards and committees that are planning Bible studies for other people to go to. They don't really want to go themselves, but they are so driven by the activities that they want to make something happen. Friends, you and I need to get to the point where we let go of our anxiety over the resources and the activities of our church and begin a conversation about what difference we are called to make and go back to our public mission of making disciples, making a difference in the world, and taking one more step, just one step closer to the kingdom of God. We need to do that because the world around us has changed. And so I'm going to ask the question, your congregation has a purpose. What is it? I've said from the very beginning that my hope is that you're not going to take any answers out of this. And my other hope is, for goodness sakes, friends, do not go home after these kinds of conversations and have a committee meeting. Oh, we got to sit down and talk about what that guy Rendle was talking about. Don't have a committee meeting. What I need you to do is to go home with a good question and put the good question on the table and say, who else wants to wrestle with me and the Spirit of God and talk about this? Now, I told you yesterday I want you to pay attention to what question belonged to you. This may not be it. You may need to take home some other variant of this question. That's up to you. But what I am going to do, and this will be the last thing we'll work on here this afternoon, the last thing I'm going to do is invite you that when you go home, whatever you say, please say something. Let's talk about relationships for a minute. Real quick, friends. Every vital organization is built on two pillars. One is purpose, and one is relationship. Vital organizations depend upon knowing very clearly what is it that they are working for, what difference they're trying to make, and then after they get clarity about that, what they do is that they build relationships. They work with the people to organize them in harmony around that purpose. How's that go? Does that make sense? So you walk into a brick and mortar bookstore and you go over to the business section and you look at the business section and there's going to be a whole row of books on visioning, the role of the leader to vision. And what that's all about is clarifying purpose. This is who we are. This is what we do. This is the difference we're trying to make. That's a vital role of leadership in any organization. But right underneath that is another shelf of books all about building teams. Have you seen them? That team building is about how do you get all the people organized in some fashion in agreement to the greatest of their skills and ability and their temperaments to begin to work around that purpose in order to fulfill what this organization is intending to do. The reason I'm asking you when you go home to say something about this kind of stuff that we're talking about is because we live in two different reward systems, you and I, as leaders of congregations. This pendulum goes back and forth between purpose and relationship. One of the things that the sociologist Peter Takayama has pointed out is that within any Christian denomination, it is the denomination itself and the seminaries and the judicatory offices and the conference and the district superintendents who lean very heavily toward purpose. And when you speak with seminaries and the denomination and your bishop and your district superintendents, they want to have a very purposeful conversation with you. And if you have a very purposeful conversation, you are rewarded. They go away smiling. And their smiles translate into appointments. So you want to have these purposeful conversations. And you who are laity want to have them too, because don't forget, these conversations result in what? Appointments. Well, when you're here, you get rewarded for talking about purpose. Takayama said that when the denomination leans more into purpose, the congregation leans very deeply into relationship. When you all go home, you're going home to a system that is highly relational and that will reward you for caring for every person in it. Fair enough? And suddenly your reward system has shifted. So you get to come to these kinds of conversations that we're having right now. And because nobody else goes home with you, you get to go home and say nothing about it. Because if you do, it will disrupt the relationships. Somebody's going to lose something that they have been very comfortable with if we pursue a public mission. One of your temptations will be to listen to the kind of stuff that we've been working on right now and kind of say to yourself, well, you know, that Rendle's not as dumb as he looks. That was pretty good. And then go home and say nothing. But in a world where the mission field has changed and the culture around us is so different, and you and I need to learn our new way into this wilderness, conversation is the currency of change. You need to be able to go home and pick up a conversation with a better question that allows you to talk to people who don't understand you, to give responses that you don't understand so that you can stay in it long enough until you find out again who you are, why God has called you, and what difference your community needs you to make. And we'll pick the conversation up there tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Gil. Oh, those mind-bending questions.
Well, good morning, friends. This is our final conversation together, and I thank you for staying with me through this. We've been trying to build not just a conversation, but a logic that would want you to go back home and have a conversation that may be different from what you have had in the past. So let's go ahead and work our way into this. Let's pick up our conversation today where we left it off yesterday, that in fact there is a missional question for you and your congregation. And that is that your congregation has a purpose. What is it? May I suggest that one of the reasons that our work is as hard as it is because we are now being pushed back into fundamental conversations. One of my favorite quotes from Walter Brueggemann is that when the people of God are in the wilderness, they always have to answer the same two questions. The first question is, how will we now be with God? And the second question is, how will we now be with one another? Those are fundamental questions. Today in our congregations, because we are now in this new mission field that we were describing, particularly yesterday, we are pushed back into those kind of fundamental questions again in terms of who are we now and what is God calling us to do now and who is our neighbor now. The problem with fundamental questions is that we think we already have the answer. And because we think we already have the answer, it doesn't occur to us to dig deeper. And it doesn't occur to us to stay with the question longer until we learn something new. I was playing with this when I was with the laity the other night, and I was asking them how many people in that room thought of themselves as younger than they actually are, and you know, they all raised their hand because we all do. And then I said to them, that's because they knew more about who they were than about who they are. Friends, you and I are in congregations that are long-established institutions. Long-established institutions always know more about who they were than about who they currently are. And because we think of ourselves that way back then, we don't keep asking the question. Your congregation has a purpose. What is it? Let's move on to the next slide if we can. Here's one of the things that sometimes people might want to point to. It should be familiar language for all of us at some point in our lives. It comes from the baptismal covenant. It comes from our reception of members. We often stand up or sit down with our hymnals and all read together the churches of God and will be preserved to the end of time for the conduct of worship and the due administration of God's word and sacraments, and the maintenance of Christian fellowship and discipline, the edification of believers and the conversion of the world. And then we say, all of every age and station stand in need of the means of grace which it alone supplies. Have you heard that before? You bet. You bet. And our temptation is to point at that and say, that is our purpose. This is where we need to work deeper, friends. That is not our purpose. That is our strategy. Those are activities. Remember, we were talking yesterday about input, throughput, and output. We're going to come back to that again today. This is a historic statement of our throughput. It still doesn't get us to that question about what is it that we're trying to make different. It just tells us here are primary activities by which we try to get at this issue of making something different, either in the lives of people or in our community. Of course we do these things. And of course we want to do these things well. And of course you have been working as leaders to get as good as you can get in doing this kind of work. But that's why we need to move beyond the good leadership that we already have, because doing this well isn't the end of the story. It still doesn't get us to the purpose. Your congregation has a purpose. What is it? What is it that you will bend these activities toward in order to make something different? How are we doing? Is this making sense in terms of digging a little bit deeper? We've got to keep going with this. And so the part of the conversation that I want to have today with you is that in terms of leadership, this leadership that is beyond the good leadership that we already have, one of the things that we're going to have to do is we're going to have to deal with ourselves. Before we go on and talk about what's going to be different, we actually have to deal with ourselves because we are in our own way. And that's the argument that I want to have with you today. Now, when we get to that point, the first inclination is that you would hope that somebody that you flew in, were polite enough to give him some time on the stage, would then tell you what is the answer. And I already told you the day of the expert is over. We're not going to do that. Has it occurred to you that if the last time we posted any kind of growth in our culture within our United Methodist Church was 1965, we're now pushing, 57 years or something like that. If someone had figured out the answer, don't you think they would have mentioned it by now? This is not about someone coming in and giving you the answer. This is about you and I wrestling with ourselves. And we talked earlier about the problem of problem solving. Problem solving doesn't work unless you have a problem. We are not in the midst of a problem, friends. We are in the midst of a mission field that has changed and come to surround us in a confusing way. This is a condition that we are now living with. And the problem with experts is that they will tell you what to do. And they will often tell you what to do because of what worked someplace. But not at all what might be needed in your place. What we really have to wrestle with here, friends, is something needs to change, and the thing that needs to change is us. Now, this is the part of the conversation that I had on the first night with the laity. And we're going to walk back through a couple of these things. Because we are so schooled to do what we do. And I told them the story of Nahshon, son of Abinadab, not a well-known character in the Old Testament text. As a matter of fact, he only shows up in the Midrash, which is the commentary that the ancient rabbis gave to fill in the extra spaces in the text, because the rabbis would read the text and then they would start to ask, well, what happened there? And I wonder what that was like. And they would begin to tell stories and they would fill in and they would supply the rest of the story. And the part of the story that they told in the Old Testament text of the Exodus is that when the Israelites left Egypt and they were fleeing Pharaoh's army and they got to the banks of the Red Sea and the waters were there with the promise that they would part, but by the time they got there, the waters had not parted. So do you know what they did? All the leaders of the tribe sat down and they began to argue about who should go into the water first. They had a committee meeting. And in my work with congregations, I have said I have been in that committee meeting so many times. They argued who would go into the water first until Nahshon could take it no more. And he stood up with quiet courage. Not boldness, not saying, everybody, I've got the answer, come follow me. He just listened to God's promise and said, I will trust it. And he began to walk, and he walked into the water up to his ankles, and the water did not part. Up to his knees and up to his waist, and the waters did not part. Up to his shoulders and up to his chin. And it wasn't until he took the step that would have put his nose underwater that the waters parted and the promise was fulfilled. The Midrash tells wonderful stories. I love that story. I carry it with me. And the reason I carry it with me is because it helps me to wrestle with myself. If we are going to take faithful steps toward the promise of God, we have to stop having committee meetings. Committee meetings are the product of a people who don't know what to do, so when you don't know what to do, you do what you know. Doing what we know means that when we can't figure out what went wrong, then we start asking the question, who went wrong? And we start blaming each other. Friends, if we're going to live in this new mission field, the issue is we have to deal first with us. And when we find something that doesn't work, we have to stop doing it. The Red Queen effect is actually the name given in the social sciences to the fact that when people are not succeeding, what they tend to do is that they work faster and harder at what they've proven doesn't work. And this is the Red Queen effect that comes from Lewis Carroll's book on Through the Looking Glass, where Alice meets the Red Queen and trying to get away from the Red Queen starts to run and runs faster and faster and faster, only to stay in the same place. That's you and me when we have trouble filling out the nomination report for the district superintendent and we get a couple of people who say no. So what do? We ask 5 more people until somebody says, well, they didn't. So we ask 10 more people. So we ask 50. Okay, we're now running around asking 20 people whether they will fill a slot on a report without ever asking ourselves, does that committee have anything to do with the difference that we're trying to make that God has asked in this coming year? That's the Red Queen effect. If we don't change ourselves, we will lose all of our energy and our focus and our direction on fulfilling institutional requirements that may or may not have any relationship to the difference that God has asked us to make in people's lives or in our community. How are we doing? Are we making sense this morning? And don't forget, this is where you say yes. All right? We're in this together. And so the part that I'm after here is that we need to move on to a deeper challenge. It's about learning something new. But if it's about learning something new, it's also about unlearning the old us, changing us. And so let me ask you to just kind of share a little exercise with me, if you would, this morning. Somewhere on a piece of paper, if you would, I'd like you to take a moment and just write down your telephone number. Just write down your telephone number. Except, I would like you to do it using your non-dominant hand. Okay, it looks like most people have been able to accomplish the task, and so a couple of questions here, friends. First of all, were you able to do it? Sure, it's not a problem, you could do that. Did it take longer than usual? Yes, absolutely. Does it look as good as it might if you had done it with your dominant hand? No, of course not. Because this is new behavior, and you have to give it intentional thought, and you have to give it more time, and you have to put up with the discomfort. Was this a little bit uncomfortable for you? Absolutely. But the part I want you to see is that you could do it. When asked, you could do it. We okay so far? Okay, so here's the real big question. Next time somebody asks you to write down your telephone number and doesn't tell you to do it with your non-dominant hand, which hand are you going to use? You're going to do it the way you always did it. Because it is deeply deeply learned behavior. It is so comfortable that you will naturally do it. Friends, look at this room and just consider, if you added up all of the years of church experience that is in this room, how large that number might be. You are a deeply practiced people in what you currently do. And you are a deeply practiced people in terms of how you currently think of things. But yet, surrounded by a new mission field, we have to look differently, think differently, and behave differently, each one of those being as uncomfortable as using your non-dominant hand. Each one of them leading to a temptation to going back to old ways. This is us having to work with ourselves. And so my argument, and the one that I lay out from my experience in this book that has been kind of the foundation of our conversations, the Quietly Courageous book, I make the argument that there are 4 assumptions and 3 temptations that we have to wrestle with ourselves. 4 assumptions. Oh, wait a minute, let's go back to that other slide. I almost forgot about the 3-tiered self. This is one of the ways in which psychology has often talked about the human person. In terms of our personalities, there are 3 parts to ourselves. There is that which is the conscious self. This is what we know about ourselves and that we operate out of. And for the most part, everybody also knows that about us as well. I mean, it's conscious. It's just really kind of easily available. There is the unconscious part of ourselves, which is that which is unavailable to us. This is what I don't know about myself. If I wanted to know this about myself, I would have to do a significant amount of work and digging to uncover it. It is hidden. But in between the conscious self and the unconscious self is the tacit self. And the tacit self is the part of us that is hidden only because it has become normative. It has become the natural way that we go about things, and we don't think about it a whole lot. Part of my tacit self is that I am a deep introvert. I'm a very quiet person when I'm not doing public speaking. If you have any questions about that, ask my wife. Every once in a while, she would like my tacit self to be a little bit more aware so that I might actually say something at breakfast. But you know, the thing is, it's tacit. It's there. It's available to me. I can remind myself I am being too quiet. I can raise the tacit to the conscious and make decisions about it. Does that make sense? Okay, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about that part of ourselves that if we give it a little bit of attention, we can in fact move it up to a place where we can make other choices, where we can choose other behaviors, when we can look in different ways. So this is tacit stuff that we have to wrestle with. So let's go on and take a look at the assumptions that I argue that there are, 4 assumptions that are fundamental in terms of how we're going to have to look and to listen and to learn in different ways in order to live in this new mission field. One has to do with the assumptions of change. In some of these conversations, I kind of brushed up against that. We can no longer think of ourselves as being able to lead change. We now have to think in terms of leading in an environment of change. And I cannot tell you what a world of difference that is. We need to explore that deeply because it requires something quite different from us. We have to rethink and challenge our assumptions about resources. And we're going to come back to that again this morning because that's fundamental to who you are and who I am. Our assumptions about structure and processes, including how we make decisions together, our assumptions about learning, how to lead, and in terms of how we do our leadership formation. These are fundamental to living in the new mission field. And then our temptations, the 3 temptations. The temptation of nostalgia, of trying to go back to a remembered time. Our congregations say, do you remember when we used to have to set up extra chairs for the Christmas Eve service? And then they start talking about how can we get back there. Friends, you can't. For the most part, you can't. I have been just kind of taken by Yuval Levin's book on the fractured republic, because he applies some of these same things to our corporate life in our nation, and he talks about our congressional parties and our Democrats and Republicans as being in this point of nostalgia. And he'll talk about the Democrats trying to reach back to the great society of the 1960s, where the government steps in and tries to care for the populace, and that our Democrats are trying to recapture a good history that they had in the 1960s, while the Republicans are trying to go back to the Reagan years of the 1980s and saying that if the individuals step up and if they are successful, then there will be a trickle down of the economy that will care for people. And do you hear what's happened? Both the Republicans and the Democrats are both reaching back to something no longer exists, and nobody's talking about moving ahead. It's an argument worth pondering. How many of you and how often have I reached back trying to recapture something which stops us from looking ahead? Stops us from looking ahead. The temptation of Christian empathy. Christian empathy is a discipline of the disciple of Jesus Christ to care for others. But friend, when that care gets to the point that you and I are reluctant to disappoint anybody, to surprise anybody, to challenge anybody, to make anybody uncomfortable, to want everybody to agree with us all the time, we have overstepped the bounds of Christian empathy, so that we have allowed anybody uncomfortable to stop us from having a conversation about the purpose of Jesus Christ in our congregation. And the temptation of tiredness. You and I are often too tired from doing very unproductive things. So we're going to try to walk into that and see if we can't spend at least a few minutes going into this. As I say, this kind of tacit work is going to be ongoing for all of us, because it is like doing something with our non-dominant hand. It's going to come back and surprise us with our dominant, kind of ways, time after time after time, and we have to remind ourselves. So we're going to talk about becoming intentional about this, and here we're going to use the model that we used yesterday. The Edwards-Deming model from a system, the input, the throughput, and the output, the outcomes, the input being resources and nouns, the throughput being activities and verbs, and that conversation that so many of our congregations have kind of avoided so far of what difference does God actually ask us to do. So let's go to one of our assumptions, the assumption of resources. Friends, I would like to suggest that you and I have limited ourselves because of our belief in the myth of limited resources. Most of the congregations that I have worked with over my years have wrestled with the idea that they don't have enough. Have you ever had that conversation in your congregation? We worry about whether we have enough money to meet the budget. We wonder whether or not we have enough money to care for our facilities. We wonder if we have enough members coming in order to sustain us. We worry about whether there's enough youth in our youth groups. Our worry over our resources dominates much of what we talk about when we talk about mission and ministry. So let me invite you into a little conversation about scarcity, abundance, and enough. This comes from the work of Lynn Twist. And Lynn Twist is not a Christian. She has Jewish background. But in her work, globally, she has worked with the wealthiest people on the globe and with the poorest people on the globe. And so her look at resources gives us a very different lens to go through. And one of the things that she says is that you and I, living in the United States, in one of the most abundant corners of the globe, are a people who live by the myth of scarcity. We always believe that there is not enough. And to point that out, she simply asked the question, how often have you heard yourself saying, I don't have enough time to get all that done? Has that ever been part of your conversation? How many of you have said, I didn't get enough sleep? Oh, that one hit some kind of a nerve. Well, hang on, there's a nap coming here in a few minutes. But what she points out is that we are a people, because we live in a consumer society, who have learned to measure our life by what we do not have. We don't measure what we do have, we measure what we don't have. And because we're always measuring what we don't have, and this is part of the consumer society, because in the consumer society, whatever you do have, you can always get more. But by measuring everything that we don't have, we live with this myth of scarcity, and so we want instead an abundance. Have you not read at some time the theology of abundance and the various streams that come out of that? And God has given us an abundant creation, and what we have to do is operate out of the abundance. But one of the things that Lynn Twist goes on to say is that we have defined abundance as more. And every time you define abundance as more, then there is always more for you to get or to experience, and guess what you're back to? Measuring what you don't yet have and measuring what you didn't yet do, and so now you're back into scarcity. She said, where is it, when is it that we finally come to that point that we accept for ourselves that we have enough? Coming through my college years, two of the authors that were most dear to my heart were people who were writing novels in kind of that dark comedy mode, Kurt Vonnegut and Joseph Heller. Vonnegut wrote Slaughterhouse-Five as one of his most important books. Heller's was Catch-22. If you're a man my age, you had to have hit one or two of them somewhere along the line. And the story is that these two men were standing together at a party that was thrown by a billionaire. Very extravagant. And Vonnegut turned to Heller and said, Joe, how do you feel about the fact that in the time that we've been spending here at this party, this man has made more money than all of the royalties that you have gotten for your Catch-22 novel? And Heller responded, well, that may be. But I have something that this man will never have. I have enough. When is it that you and I start saying to ourselves that we have enough for what God has called us to do? When can we start looking at who we are and what we have and where we are and begin to say that we may not, and this is the conversation I've had with the bishop so many times about our United Methodist Church, we may not have enough to do what we've always done. But what if we do have enough for what God is asking us to do next? We are a people who have been captured by our own nostalgia that comes out of the 1950s and the 1960s when our church was at its strongest. Don't forget, up to 1965, we had this mammoth growth in our denomination and kept posting increases in our membership and everything else. If you look on this section on the slide here that says a rising tide raises all ships, the data in terms of the expenditures on sacred architecture. Now, this is data that is drawn not just from the United Methodist Church, but from all religious organizations during this period of time in the United States. In 1945, all of our congregations spent $45 million on buildings, new buildings, architecture. Look what happened. By 1950, 5 years later, 45 million has jumped to 409 million. Within a 15-year period, jumped to 1 billion. That is a huge expansion. Do you feel it? The problem is that the good old baby boomers grew up in that time, and they remember everything fondly. And so as a church, you and I have learned how to look through rose-colored glasses back to that period as if that is the standard that we are now supposed to be living. We have made that the norm in our minds, that we should always be working with expanding resources. When the culture has expanding resources, a rising tide raises all ships. You don't have to do a whole lot to be a success during that period of time. When the culture is pushing people towards you, all you have to do is make sure you've unlocked the door. A rising tide raises all ships. And so anybody who has a good idea, the answer is yes. We would come to annual conference and say, we think we should raise, this part of the budget by $100,000, and somebody would jump up and say, well, what about this program? Oh yeah, that's really a priority too, and another $100,000. And oh, well, what about this? And don't forget the camps, because I met my wife there. And a rising tide raised all ships, and we did not have to learn how to make any decisions. We just kept throwing resources at it. But in a time of shrinking resources, you actually have to make decisions. As leaders, you have to be able to say, this is more important than that. Not because of what it's done historically, but because of what God calls us to make different now. Now. Do you hear it? Do you know how hard that is? Do you know how much our bishops struggle with that? You who are leaders in your congregation, how many times have you come up with a good idea only to have somebody say, well, what about? And want to add something else, whether it's helpful or not? Is the work that we're doing undergirded with insufficiency, with too much, or do we have enough? You and I need to bring our assumptions that are so tacit up to the surface so that we can ask ourselves again. Do you realize that a whole lot of you have too many resources? You have too much building for what you need? You have too much property. You have too many constraints on the money that has been given historically from the past. You've got too much. How do you parlay that into enough so that it begins to support what God is actually asking you to make different now? Don't miss that word now. Not for all times, but for now. Start thinking in a 3-year to a 5-year cycle. Let's go back to being intentional. What difference does God want you to make now? Look at where the resources are there on the input. The nouns. What if you already have enough? One of the things that Deming pointed out to the Japanese when they were rebuilding their manufacturing industry is that when you begin to think about what you're trying to rebuild, you never start at the beginning. I better do it so you're looking here. You never start at the beginning, you always start at the end. You build your system backwards. Because until you determine what you're trying to do, until you determine what you're trying to make different, you have no idea what resources you need. you first have to ask the question, my congregation has a purpose. What is it? My congregation has been asked in this 3 to 5 years to make a difference, either in the lives of the people who come to be disciples here or in the community in which we are located. God has asked us to make a difference. Until we can describe that difference, we have no idea how much resources we need. Instead, we get anxious because it may not be as much as we had last year. We've got to change the conversation. We've got to make it different. So let's turn to one of the temptations. If that was one of the assumptions, let's turn to one of the temptations, the temptation of tiredness. And here's where we're caught between Scylla and Charybdis. Now, this is not a whole lot different from the notion that being caught between a rock and a hard place. This is just a little bit richer, and we're going to kind of walk into this. This is metaphor. We're going to use metaphor here that comes from Homer's epic poem, The Odyssey, when Odysseus is trying to get back home after the 10-year war in Troy. Now, I don't know if you've ever read any of this stuff, but certainly it's kind of in our culture. It was a perilous journey, and in the tales of Homer trying to get back, or Odysseus trying to get back home, it comes to the point where he has to steer his ship between Scylla and Charybdis, often pictured as massive monsters that are coming out of the sea. And this is the Strait of Messina, and so on the left-hand side on that tour would be the mountains that were the coastline of Italy at that point. Mountainous kind of rocks that could destroy a ship if you're thrown up against it. And on the other side is a whirlpool, Charybdis, this kind of natural movement of water that if you get your ship caught in there, it can destroy you. And so the perilous journey is to find your way through this path between Scylla and Charybdis. And friends, this is us. Scylla, those mountainous rocks, those swirling aspirations that you and I live with. That we start telling ourselves that we are a people who are going to bring the kingdom of God, that somehow we are going to reintroduce the peaceable kingdom, that somehow we're going to take and make this the great city on top of the hill again, and that we can take people and turn them into disciples, and we can transform the whole world. And we get very, very colorful as we describe our purpose, do we not? Which is appropriate. We have some of the best language that our culture has ever seen in terms of understanding the values that are worth living toward. Absolutely. But if the only thing we ever do is frame them as these massive aspirations, then the first thing that we have to recognize is that we can't do it. We can't do it. We cannot get the lion to lay down with the lamb. We can't even get the Republicans to talk to the Democrats. We can frame that another way when we come into our own house. If we leave our work at the aspirational level, it is undoable. And we will be rewarded for it. It's known as a concept of surplus powerlessness. This comes from the work of Michael Lerner, a social theorist, who once was a radical in the 60s, editor of the Ramparts magazine, if your mind goes back that far enough. And one of the things that he would say is that the radical youth movement at that point would set up these massive aspirational goals of how they were going to change the whole U.S. government and make everything right again. Do you remember any of that language back then? And he said one of the reasons that they would set it up in such an aspirational way is because they knew that they would fail, but by failing, they would prove how important they were. Because after all, we went up against the man. Do you hear what happened? They set themselves up for failure. At the same time, they set themselves up for reward. You and I do that. When we start talking about being the people who bring the kingdom of God, no. We've not been asked to bring the kingdom of God. We've been asked to help ourselves and others move one step closer to it. That's all. One step closer to it. One of the stories that I've told in annual conferences for years now has been the story about the mother who, on a very, very dark night on the farm, says to her young son, go on out and check the barn and make sure the barn door is locked. And so the little boy goes out the door and he comes back in about 15 seconds. And his mother says, what's the matter? And he says, well, it's too dark. I can't see the barn. She said, no problem. She picks up the flashlight, gives the flashlight to the little boy, sends him out to check the barn door. He comes back in 20 seconds. And she says, what's the problem? And he said, well, the flashlight's not strong enough. I still can't see the barn. She said, you don't need to see the barn. Just walk to the end of the light. And every time you and I walk to the end of the light, what happens? We see the next part of the path until we walk to the end of the light and we see a little bit more. Friends, you and I are not here to bring in the peaceable kingdom. You and I are here to take the next step, which may be as simple as civility. You and I are to take the next step, which may be learning the discipline of listening. What is the difference that God has asked you to make, which is actually work that you can do? If our mountainous aspirations threaten us, so do our swirling activities. Charybdis. This is us just doing more and more and more, faster and faster of what we know until we exhaust ourselves, by the way, for which we get rewarded. How many of you have sat in a PPR meeting to have your pastor say, well, let me show you my calendar, to prove how diligently he or she has been working at ministry, without having a conversation about, did it make any difference? Becoming intentional. Throughput, the activities and the verbs, how many, how often, how much. Again, we have to build the system backwards. What's the difference you're trying to make before you start asking, what are the activities that you need to get online? Before you start talking about what steps you have to take, what direction are you going? Your congregation has a purpose. What is it? Let's move ahead to the slide that says it begins with conversation. This is the part I've been trying to say with you all along. It begins with conversation, with a discerning conversation. This isn't just conversation you and I have with each other. This is also conversation that we have with God. This is not conversation that happens without prayer. Prayer is part of that conversation that we need so that we follow that which comes from within us as much as from the stimulus that comes from without of us. This is us continuously following the discipline of Scripture so that we are informed with purpose and with language. This is us opening ourselves up to a voice that goes beyond us, that continues to invite us in a purposeful direction. This is, in fact, conversation with God. Please don't go home and have a committee meeting. I've said that so many times. Please do go home and pick up your disciplines of prayer and Scripture. What is the word that God has for you now? And it is a conversation with other leaders. But that's why I've been asking you all along through these little conversations that we've been having to shape the best question you can hear so that when you go home, you have a different conversation that might come out with some different insights. Do you know what happens when you have the same conversation with the same people about the same question? You tend to come up with the same responses. Go home with a different question. Go home with a better question. Go home with a question that, not one that I gave you, but one that belongs to you. Where do you need to start this? And friends, the conversation also has to happen with your neighbors, your context. If the mission field has changed around us so that it is no longer convergent and it is now divergent, there are so many multiple divergent voices out there that if you do not listen to them, they will not listen to you. This is a conversation that has to go. So the question is, what will you take home? What do you need to relearn? I'd like you to think about that. And I really do encourage you. I know that this is a busy schedule that you're on and you're moving from issue to issue to issue. When you find a few moments, friends, would you please sit down with a pencil and paper and just make some notes to yourself so that you don't lose it here. If you don't write it down, you won't take it with you. What is it that you actually think you need to relearn? Who will you invite into your conversation? And I've been saying, don't go home and have a committee meeting. And one of the reasons for that is when you sit down at a committee table, you will behave like a committee. And if you take this back to your governing board and say, we should be talking about this because Rendle said so, you're taking it to a governing board that is going to do governance, not learning. Who are the 2 or 3 other people who are of a discerning spirit in your congregation? Who are the 2 or 3 other people who really like to think and learn new things? Who are the 2 or 3 other people who are willing to have a conversation that doesn't already have an answer to it? There is more discernment that happens in adult chairs with a cup of coffee in your right hand than ever happened around a committee table. Who will you invite into the conversation? And what will you talk about? Your congregation has a purpose. What is it? Bishop, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, friends, for inviting me into your conversation. You're all set. Okay?
Thank you.
Good. All right.
Thank you. Appreciate you a lot. All righty. See you soon. So I hope, like me, you've been taking a few notes.